Carbon Tracker en internasjonalt anerkjent tenketank innen finans og klima, og var blant de første til å sette fingeren på hvordan raske teknologiskift og fallende priser på sol og vind skaper finansiell risiko for tradisjonelle energiaktører i kull, olje og gass. Ta vel imot forskningssjef i Carbon Tracker, James Leaton.
Good morning, and thanks very much to Zero for inviting me here today to talk a bit about our research. I think it's great that we've already heard a bit about stranded assets and climate risk and financial markets from the speakers earlier today. That shows we're doing our job and we're reaching the decision makers around the world. The piece I'd like to talk about today kind of links into that. We started off looking at the supply of coal, oil and gas around the world. And very quickly we got into a debate around demand. Why did we think there might be less need for supply in a low carbon future? What's the probability of that? And we've already heard from Brian that they found that EIA continually underestimated the speed of deployment of renewables, for example. So we worked with Imperial College in London to look at their model and what it said. We focused on two technologies in particular, the ones that have moved the most probably, solar PV and electric vehicles. So the chart you can see here, when we looked at Imperial's model, it had a baseline of 2010. So you're going back quite a long way already. And obviously in the academic process, you have a period of peer review, reviewing the literature that's previously been done. So feeding into that model was a long history of estimates on, in this case, solar PV costs. And Imperial looked quite good. They come out, fairly towards the bottom of that range. The challenge was, when we looked at what it had already done in the first 7 years of that profile, it's outside the range. So the model that they had, which had just been used, for example, by the UK government in a study, didn't have the current cost of solar even in the range of studies that had fed into the model. And certainly the cost it was applying in a cost optimization model, which compares costs of different technologies, was certainly out of date. So that meant we had to essentially unpick all the model and try and update it with these costs and see what difference it made. And I think that was a really valuable exercise for the modeling community, for Imperial. But it does raise questions about the data that's being used by decision makers. And I think it's really important to continue to challenge the numbers being used, the data that's feeding into these processes. Another example outside of this study, but just on the wind side, so the EU has a reference scenario that it produced last year. You can see the costs for offshore wind there. So for 2020, the estimate is 123 euros per megawatt hour, dropping down to around 90 in 2050. Again, there's a big issue here in that the winning bids most recently were around 64 euros, so already around half the 2020 number. So this is why the phrase business as usual reference just doesn't work anymore. We're already outside of business as usual. We need to make sure we're starting at the right point, because otherwise we're essentially having to try really hard to get from this sort of concept of business as usual down to where we are already, down to where we are with the current policies and current technologies and where they're headed. So we really need to push to have the right starting point there. So back to the Imperial study. So electric vehicles we wanted to try and work out how you could displace 2 million barrels of oil. That would at least more than offset the predicted growth in oil demand that the industry had. So you're getting peak oil demand, and that changes the whole dynamic of the industry, changes how the market views it, because then you're a shrinking industry, you're not a growing industry anymore, and you have to have a different business model, a different mindset. So I guess just to highlight what we looked at here, so our model is the green bars in terms of oil displacement. That's just including the equivalent of the national determined contributions from Paris and the updated electric vehicle technology costs. You can see that's actually below the blue bars, which is essentially continuing the current growth rate of 60% increase in sales per annum. So it's actually tempered that back a bit. It's a bit more conservative than just continuing the current trend. But you can see it's still way above where other scenarios are. BNF have updated theirs actually, so it's closer. The IEA World Energy Outlook will come out again in November, but certainly the last iteration was well below where we see it coming out with that policy and technology. So that's important because you're getting decades of difference in projections here. Some people are starting to talk about peak oil demand in the 2020s. Others are still talking about 2040, 2050. And that's important in terms of which scenarios people use. So we've just done some work with the PRI, an international group of investors, to look at the implications of the IEA 450 scenario for upstream oil and gas capital expenditure. So what should they spend out to 2025 to meet future demand levels under that scenario, which is still quite a generous scenario because it only gives a 50% probability of a 2-degree outcome. So even under that scenario, you don't need to ramp back up to the previous heady days of 2014 and $100 oil. You still invest some to maintain levels of production and offset decline. But that's probably the most you'd need to do going forward, even under fairly conservative predictions. And what does this mean for other sectors? What does it mean for refineries, for the oil and gas contracting industry? What does it mean for the auto sector? And I think this is where investors are finding there's increasing divergence between what the auto sector is saying and what the oil sector may be saying, particularly in the US. And the opportunities will go to those who seize them, and I think this is why I've called this the LG Bolt, not the Chevy Bolt, because half of that car is produced by LG, which just announced this week it's going to open the biggest battery plant in Europe. So this is about a completely different supply chain, completely different sets of companies that could be the winners here. And data really drives all this. I think this is where it's really important that Norway can provide an example. People are already looking at the EV rollout here, as we've heard, to understand what does that data tell us about how people use these cars, how we can manage energy demand around that. And data will be key to having a successful transition, whether it's the diversification, the decentralization. I did run out of Ds eventually in this list. I think you're only supposed to have 3, really, but I kept going. But it does come back to the data, and I think it's really important that we get better data about the latest trends and that we feed that into decision makers. Otherwise, we risk committing capital now, which will be playing out in a very different context. And this is where we're really trying to get people to look past the oil price this week, because historically, you can pretty much track capital expenditure mirroring with a slight lag to the oil price. And if we continue to do that, that's going to cause us a structural issue as EVs roll out and impinge oil demand. Just to be open, that oil is obviously used for a range of purposes, and the light vehicle sector is only a portion of that barrel. So it's not, stop oil overnight. There are other uses, and we need to do more work around heavy vehicles. But I think if we can get to that point of actually this is no longer a growth sector, that's really going to change how the market views it. And I think this is a key challenge, and it's great that we've got a Chinese EV company speaking later today, because we really need to understand what's going to happen in China. That's where all of the industry models look to for future growth in oil demand. So understanding that, if you're a driller in Texas, is a challenge, perhaps. Why do you need to think about that? Well, because it's beyond your control. Aside from the federal policy issue, the future of oil markets is also beyond the control of the US government. And I think that's where we really need to see some some more thinking about what trajectories could go forward that aren't just all lines go up. So thanks very much, and I just encourage you to keep challenging everyone on the data they're using, the assumptions they're making in their models, and making sure it's the latest numbers that go into them. Thanks very much.